Welcome to Session 2, entitled In the Promised Land. In the first session, we looked at the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Law or the Pentateuch. And so now let's recite Genesis through the Song of Solomon. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. In the next session, Session 3, we'll complete the Old Testament, and so we will recite Genesis through Malachi. Here once again is the timeline, and you can see where Joshua falls on that timeline. So turn to Joshua, chapter 1, verse 1, and page 16 in your workbooks. In Joshua, the theme is choice, making good and godly decisions. Joshua is a Hebrew word which means Yahweh is salvation. Jesus is a Greek word which means the same thing. Just as Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land, so Jesus leads us into heaven. Joshua emphasizes 5 things. First of all, the importance of the law. In Joshua 1:8, we read, "This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, and be careful to do everything written in it. Then you'll be prosperous and have success." Going on to chapter 2, verse 4, Rahab enters the picture. And what did she do? She hid the 2 spies that came to spy out the city of Jericho. And why did she hide them? We read in verses 9 through 11, "I know the Lord has given you this land. We've heard what you've done and lost heart, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below." Imagine Rahab, a harlot, a pagan, living in a pagan city, coming to this realization of who God is and trusting in him. In verses 12 and 13, she makes a request, "Spare the lives of my family." And so the spies replied, "We will if you don't report our mission. Tie this red cord in the window and bring your family inside, or their blood will be on your hands." So she lowered the 2 spies out the window with the red cord. So we see this red cord representing the shedding of blood, weaving its way even through this story. We read later that this pagan prostitute, Rahab, was an ancestor of King David. Next, we see God's holiness in judging sin in chapters 6 and 7. We see that Jericho was to be a tithe to God. They were to give the goods that they got from Jericho back to God's storehouse. But what happened? Achan, one of the soldiers, took some of what was to be set apart to God. And the result? They lost their next battle to the small town of Ai. When it was found out what Achan did, he and his family were stoned. This reminds us of a similar story in the New Testament. This story with Achan happened as soon as the Hebrews crossed over into the Promised Land. And in the New Testament, we read about Ananias and Sapphira right at the beginning of the church age, and how in Acts 5 they lied to God. God is holy, and we are to be holy also. And because of their lies, they too died. Next, we see God's faithfulness in conflict. After defeating Ai, Joshua built an altar on Mount Ebal. We read about this in Joshua chapter 8, verse 30. This was an altar that Moses commanded in Deuteronomy 27 that they build when they entered into the Promised Land. It's interesting that there was a Reader's Digest article on Mount Ebal. Sometimes people doubt the stories in the Bible, but the finding of archaeologists have backed up what the Bible says. And this article talks about finding this altar on Mount Ebal. And here is a picture of that altar that has been reconstructed. After building this altar, Joshua continues with his campaigns. The southern campaign is noted in chapters 8 through 10, and then he turns to the northern campaigns in chapters 13 through 21. The next part of Joshua is that the 12 tribes receive their inheritance. This is in chapters 13 through 21. And after receiving their inheritances, they all lived happily ever after, right? No, the land was theirs, but a great deal of land needed to be possessed. Did they drive out these people that were left? No, they didn't. They failed to do so. And why did they not root out all of the enemy? Because it wasn't convenient. We read in Judges 1 that the enemy was used as forced labor. The Israelites chose to let their enemy remain, and their enemy became a snare and a trap to them because of their false gods. That brings us to the fifth and final part of Joshua, the importance of choice. Joshua assembled all the tribes together, we read in chapter 22 through 24. And in Joshua chapter 24, we read what the Lord said. I took Abraham from his land. I gave him Isaac. I gave him Jacob and Esau. I brought you out of Egypt. I brought you to the Jordan River, and I gave you a land you didn't have to work for. God was faithful. And so Joshua challenges them in chapter 24, verse 15. Choose who you will worship. As for me and my house, we choose to serve the Lord. We've been given free will. Our lives revolve around and are almost totally determined by the choices we make. Choices made in the physical realm, what we drink or eat, whether or not we exercise. Decisions made in the mind or the soul realm, how we spend our time, our money, our attitude, our words. And choices that are made in the spiritual realm, if and how we will love and serve God. Have my choices been wise ones? Next, we'll see what choices they made. Now we'll go to the timeline once again, and the period of the judges. From the death of Joshua until the beginning of King Saul's reign was a period of about 350 years. And this is the time that the book of the Judges covers. The theme of Judges is recurring sin. Joshua speaks of a book of victory, but Judges gives us a book of defeat. And here is a list of the 14 judges that ruled over Israel. Othniel was the first judge, and he was a good judge. But these judges got progressively worse as they go down the line until we finally get to Eli, who was a bad judge. And then the last of the judges was Samuel. He was the greatest judge. And so as we go through the book of Judges, we see this cycle of apostasy, where apostasy is a departure from the truth that God has revealed in His Word. And so it begins with the sin of the people, and as a result of that sin, they enter into servitude to their enemies. But then they begin to pray to God, supplication. And with that, He sends them a judge who saves them, who defeats their enemy. And that leads to a period of serenity and peace. But it is short-lived, and soon they enter into sin once again. We read in Judges, the last verse, chapter 21, verse 25. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that's the same attitude we see in the United States today. Let's see why. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3, we read that the day of the Lord won't come unless the apostasy comes first, a falling away from the truth. In John chapter 18, 37, Jesus tells us, I came into the world to testify to the truth. I'll describe truth with these 5 following words. First of all, truth is real. It is the picture of reality, what really exists or what really happened. Next, truth is objective. It's not just a personal opinion or a preference. Next, truth is narrow. In the physical world, truth is narrow. 2 plus 2 is 4. It's not 5, it's not 3.9. And in the spiritual world, truth is narrow as well. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, verses 13 and 14, Jesus speaks of a narrow gate and a narrow path that leads to life. Next, truth is revealed. It comes to us from God. In John 8, verses 31 to 32, we read that if you abide in my word, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And so I like to think of this truth that John is talking about here as a bubble. If you abide within my word, if you stay within this bubble, you will be set free. And last, truth is absolute. It is unchanging. But our culture has fallen from the truth. I believe that we're now living in the time of this apostasy that precedes the Lord's return. Let me explain why with a very abbreviated history lesson. After the fall of the Roman Empire, about 450 years after Pentecost, Western Europe and that part of the world entered into the so-called Dark Ages. The only Bibles were hand-copied. They were manuscripts, and there were very few of them. That's why Johann Gutenberg wanted to invent the printing press in 1452, to print Bibles. He was quoted as saying, "Religious truth is imprisoned in a small number of books. Let us give wings to truth in order that she may go and win every soul that comes into this world." And so, God's truth was revealed. This was followed by the Renaissance and the explosion of modern science. The revelation of a God who was orderly, who created an orderly universe, led to the discovery of natural laws through observation, and that led to reason. And reason is good. The Lord tells us in Isaiah 1, verse 18, "Come, let us reason together." And during this time, mankind still believed in absolute truth. They believed that there was a bubble within which we could live peaceably if we would just live in a reasonable manner. But a very gradual shift in thinking occurred over the next 300 years. And we entered into the age of reason, or the age of modern man, or the age of enlightenment. And what were we enlightened to? That we can only trust what we observe with our natural senses. That there were no miracles, no walking on water, or changing that water to wine. And so, revelation was rejected. But what did reason gradually lead to? Turmoil. The 20th century was the bloodiest on record. There were 63 different wars in the 20th century. There were totalitarian regimes, those of Hitler, Stalin, Mao in China, and Pol Pot in Cambodia. And what about the Industrial Revolution? Even though that brought many good things to us, it also brought about congestion in our cities and tension as people gathered into cities and urban centers. Also, there was an increase in technology that gave us more tools with which to destroy ourselves. After World War II, people lost hope. Reason didn't lead to a perfect world in which we could be set free. Instead, they concluded there is no absolute truth, no single bubble of truth in which all mankind can live in harmony. This resulted in a new belief system, relativism, that there is no absolute right or wrong. Truth is relativistic. Truth changes. Now we can choose to live as we want. We live in our own truth bubbles, finding our own truth, doing whatever we want. If we want to have an abortion, fine. Take drugs, non-biblical sexual practices, euthanasia, Whatever we want to do is all right. There was an article in the Parade magazine a few years back in which Tobey Maguire, the actor, was interviewed. And in this article, he was quoted as saying, "I had to find my own truth." The only requirement that we have now is to be tolerant of others. But Christians, we pop the truth bubbles of others when we say Jesus is the only way. We are the intolerant ones. We are the narrow-minded ones. But remember, truth is narrow. So we're living in the time of Judges chapter 21, verse 25. Everyone doing whatever is right in their own eyes. In other words, the apostasy mentioned in 2 Thessalonians has come. We've departed from the truth. Well, here's the timeline once again. Let's go on to the story of Ruth. And when did Ruth occur? We read in the first verse of that book that it was during the time of the Judges. The main theme of Ruth is redemption. The Hebrew word for redeemer is used 20 times in Ruth. We read in the first chapter that Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their 2 sons leave Judah for Moab. He dies, the 2 sons marry, and after 10 years, the sons die. And so now Naomi returns to Judah, urging her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law to remain in Moab. Orpah stays with her people and their God, but Ruth replies in the best-known verse of the book of Ruth, "Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." And so they return to Israel. And we have a picture here of Ruth gleaning. But Boaz notices her and asks about her. And so Naomi instructs her in the Israelite redemption process. Boaz, a relative of Naomi, can redeem or buy back Naomi's land. Boaz redeems the land, marries Ruth, and because he is Rahab's son, they become the great-grandparents of King David. And so Ruth, a foreigner to the nation of Israel, is also mentioned in Jesus' genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. In the midst of the unfaithfulness of judges, Ruth is an example of love and faithfulness. And so, here we have the timeline once again. And now we go to the time of the kings and the United Kingdom. This takes us to the book of 1 Samuel. Samuel, remember, was the last judge. He is the link between the judges and the monarchy, the United Kingdom. Samuel's sons were evil, so when Samuel was old, the elders of Israel went to him and said, "Appoint a king to judge us, like the other nations have." That's in chapter 8, verse 5. Samuel knew that was wrong. They were rejecting God as their leader. But God told Samuel to give the people what they wanted. And so, who was the first king? Saul. We see in 1 Samuel chapter 10 that Samuel anoints Saul as king. But Saul was disobedient, and God later rejected him as king in chapter 15. And then in 1 Samuel 16, Samuel anoints David as king. And in the next chapter, chapter 17, we have the story of David and Goliath. And then throughout the rest of 1 Samuel, we have the stories of David and his good friend Jonathan, Saul's son. We have the conflict between David and Saul, and then Saul's death. Going on to 2 Samuel, who was the second king? Well, of course, it was David. We dated Abraham to about 2000 BC, and David we can date to about 1000 BC. In the first 10 chapters of 2 Samuel, we have good news. David is once again anointed as king. He unites the kingdom. He returns the ark to Jerusalem, and they win many wars. But then in chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, we have David's adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. In chapter 12, David is confronted by the prophet Nathan, and he repents and is forgiven. And then throughout the rest of 2 Samuel, chapters 13 through 24, we see that David's sins, as well as ours, have consequences. Even though he was forgiven, there were consequences to the sins that he committed. He and Bathsheba's son died. David's son, Amnon, raped his half-sister, Tamar, which led Absalom, Tamar's brother, to kill Amnon and rebel against David. And that caused a huge conflict. David took an ill-advised census that resulted in a plague. And so there are many things that went on in David's reign that were unfortunate due to his sin. Going on to 1 Kings. Who was the third king? Well, that was Solomon. And here's a tip if you want to find out about some of the different stories of these first three kings. The first king was Saul, and so his reign is talked about in 1 Samuel. David was the second king, and his reign is discussed in 2 Samuel. Solomon was the third king, and he is discussed in the next book, 1 Kings, the first 11 chapters. So if you want to read about David and Goliath, that happened during Saul's reign. So that would be in 1 Samuel. If you want to find out about David's sin with Bathsheba, that's while he was king. That is in 2 Samuel. Well, again, turning to 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 39, Solomon was anointed as king. In chapter 2, David dies. And so, in chapter 3, God appears to Solomon in a dream and asks, "What should I give you?" And in chapter 3, verse 9, Solomon replied, "Give your servant an obedient heart to judge your people and to discern between good and evil." And so God granted Solomon's wish, and he gave him wisdom. And so in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 16, we see that God granted Solomon's wish. He gave him wisdom. And that's where we see the story of the two women who bring the one child, both claiming that it's their child. And Solomon says to have the child divided in half. In chapter 6, Solomon is building the temple, and his wealth and reputation spread. And in chapter 10, the Queen of Sheba visits him. But then we come to chapter 11, verses 1 through 4, where we read of Solomon's 700 wives and 300 concubines, and how they turned his heart away from God and seduced him to follow false gods. In verse 43, we read of Solomon's death, bringing about the end of the United Kingdom. Let's talk about these first three kings for just a minute. Saul, David, and Solomon all did wrong things. So what was so different about David? Why was he said to be a man after God's own heart? In 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 8. Saul had a son named after Baal. Saul combined his belief in Yahweh with false worship, with false gods. Solomon also went after false gods, as I just mentioned. But David never worshiped false gods. He sinned, but he never worshiped idols. And so remember, regardless of what we've done, God will forgive us and use us as long as we repent, as David did, and serve only him and not idols. We don't have to be perfect, but he does want us to be faithful, to seek him alone. That brings the United Kingdom to a close. In the second half of this session, we'll discuss the divided kingdom.